Well, there was speculation that Premier Ford is planning on calling an early election. Joining us live now with more on this is Sabrina Nanji, founder of the Queen's Park Observer. We appreciate your time as always. Sabrina, let's talk about what are some of the rumblings down at Queen's Park. What are you hearing that could potentially indicate an election?
Yeah, well, ever since May, when the premier refused to rule out the possibility of an early election, I think it sent pretty much everybody at Queen's Park scrambling, including us reporters. I mean, Ford has been a bit wishy-washy on it, but if you talk to the opposition parties, they're preparing for the possibility of even an election later on this year. Now, I guess the pet theory around Queen's Park is that we could be going to the polls in spring of 2025. Obviously, that's ahead of the scheduled election in 2026. But this has kind of been the unofficial campaign summer. We've seen opposition parties go out door knocking. They've been running these like campaign training sessions, including even the Conservatives. I had a little scoop this week that they will be planning a big training session for like local organizers in October. The NDP and the Liberals are doing that as well. The Liberals have a big policy convention that will help inform their platform coming up in September. And both the opposition parties are now working to nominate their candidates. The Liberals in particular have a bit of a tall order because they don't have so many incumbents. The NDP is also starting with incumbents, but they're really getting all of their ducks in a row and want to be ready to go just in case Doug Ford pulls the trigger. There's still a lot of speculation, so take all of this with a grain of salt, but even Elections Ontario is also preparing for this possibility. They've been hiring election workers. They say that that's for the 2026 election, but of course, they also say they're going to be ready to go if Ford does pull the trigger early.
Well, we also know that we have a federal election that's coming up in about 14 months or so, and I'm wondering if you think, maybe the mindset is for the Conservatives to get ahead of that, and so that doesn't intersect with a potential federal election, right?
Yeah, I think you're definitely onto something there. I mean, just the fact that, having both elections around the same time or very close together, obviously there's sort of this overlap when it comes to, volunteers or canvassers. And so I think that's, logistically, that's a consideration. But Ontario is also has this weird dynamic where when we have, Conservatives at Queen's Park, we tend to vote Liberals federally and vice versa. And so I think as we're looking at the polls and seeing Justin Trudeau tanking and Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives sort of rising in popularity, I think Doug Ford is looking at that and wondering about how that's going to impact his own prospects. Another thing that he's worried about is the possibility of cuts. And obviously that would fall on the provinces too. And so, Doug Ford has already sort of said that he's willing to go to bat for Ontario and make sure Ontario's getting his fair share, no matter who is in charge federally. So I do think that they probably want to go ahead of the feds. But the big question is, what's the reason? Doug Ford has essentially carte blanche with this whopping majority at Queen's Park. So he's going to have to really, come up with a good case for going to the polls early, because we have seen that backfire in the past in Ontario.
Well, furthermore to that, I want to talk about, get your opinion on strategy. I mean, we have a couple of scandals when it comes to the Greenbelt that has been kind of lingering over this government. Also, you've got the controversy of what's happening down at Ontario Place. But at the same time, there's been historic investments in transit. There's been several of these contracts and labor disputes that have been dealt with when it comes to education, most recently the LCBO. So I'm wondering if you think some of the recent wins might have been a motivator for the Premier to call an early election.
Yeah, it seems like Doug Ford has been the Teflon premier, right? He's had a lot of policy backtracks. You mentioned the Greenbelt is sort of the big one, and now he's got this RCMP investigation looming over his head. But he's managed to still come out on top in the polls, and so I think he's probably feeling pretty good and confident right now. The opposition parties have relatively new leaders. They've been having trouble getting their message out there. So while the RCMP investigation is still, this unpredictable thing hanging over over Ford's head, he still managed to remain popular. And we've sort of heard him reminding people about, his government's greatest hits at the Association of Municipalities of Ontario's conference this week. He was sort of rattling off, a bunch of investments that have been made. We've heard them speed up the booze liberalization announcements and the timeline for that, something that I think will be popular. But he's also made a lot of big promises when it comes to housing, when it comes to transit. So, if we do go to the polls and he can't really show much progress on that, I think, maybe he'll be in jeopardy a little bit. But I think that's why we're hearing sort of these campaign style reminders from the premier, who's been up at the podium all summer, reminding people, we are spending money, maybe not something we'd expect from Ford, who's railed against the gravy train, but he has been, a big spending premier. And especially when it comes to infrastructure projects, which, as we know, are popular with the electorate.
Sabrina Nanji, founder of the Queen's Park Observer. Always great to chat. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.